Do you think there's anything that the EMRs are doing poorly?
And then sometimes bureaucracy gets in the way. You could, but that's a very tough sell.
Are they allowed to kind of say, hey, we already have this, we're not going to open the APIs up to them?
Who are you, man? And why would I, right?
So are APIs pointless?
Well, I think APIs are dead. So what is happening recently is, as we shift from conventional application to application connectivity, we are now coming up with a new world order for either AI agents to talk to existing applications and infrastructure, or AI agents to talk to other AI agents. And those are kind of the new innovations that we're excited about, as it kind of enables a new way to connect and exchange data for AI.
And, for those of you who are just watching this, Shoukri is making AI agents mostly in the medical industry. And as we know, we've spoken about this already, but there are EMRs, which are electronic medical records, that have APIs. So can you kind of walk us through what is the state of the industry and the APIs and the EMRs?
And maybe we start with defining what's an API, because I find for a lot of, non-technical folks, it's hard to wrap their head around it. So let me take a stab at this. Let's take this example, okay? So let's say, Benny, you and I need to exchange some patient information, right? And let's pretend, for this purpose of this kind of conversation that, forget regulation, forget HIPAA, forget anything else. If you and I to simply exchange patient information, you and I would agree, for example, that I'm going to create a spreadsheet. And in the spreadsheet, I'm going to have a column that says first name, another column that says last name, and maybe a column that says phone number. And I'm going to take this Excel sheet that is empty, and I'm going to email it to you. Then you're going to open that email. You're going to take that spreadsheet, fill it with some data, and then you email me back. In essence, that's what an API does. An API is a contract that you and I will agree on, and that contract specifies what data will be sent, in what structure, and how data will be received back, right? So in this case, the Excel, in my previous example, is the data format that you and I will exchange, and the email is the medium of exchange, or the channel that you and I will use to exchange the data. In the medical world, if we kind of now carry that example into the EMR world, HL7 or FHIR is a kind of a representation of that Excel sheet. So once I want to send you data about a patient, I will structure it in a certain way. And that's what HL7 FHIR specifies. And then the medium of exchange is in some cases what's called HTTP or HTTPS. And it's the same medium that, when you see a web page, that is the medium, the same medium that you exchange with a server that sends you a web page that you look at in your browser. So an API will work over HTTP or HTTPS, and that facilitates the connection. And then the structure of that data, as opposed to an Excel sheet, it can be what's called a JSON, or it could be XML.
And how are EMRs in America? What is the state of APIs? I mean, there's thousands of EMRs. What's the situation with APIs in the United States?
Well, most modern EMRs have APIs that will facilitate, interaction and integration with other external systems. However, it's, some EMRs are more mature when it comes to APIs, have very well-defined APIs that would cover, the medical exchange of the data, the billing exchange of data, and as well as, let's say, the non-medical or the administrative, right? Which is typically called the practice management. So if we're talking about, a contact of a patient, an appointment or appointments, that falls into kind of what we call practice management. If we're talking about exchanging medical data, that's where kind of the HL7 FHIR comes into play, where we're exchanging information about medications, conditions, diagnosis, diseases, all of that. And then you have kind of the billing domain, and this is where we might be talking about ICD-10 codes or CPT codes and billing-related entities or objects.
And do you think that these APIs, currently they're private, they're basically managed by the EMRs, but should they be more or less public infrastructure potentially, even though they're not?
there are existing regulations and there's upcoming regulations that I wouldn't say kind of public, but essentially will almost force EMR providers to open up their data. Now, keep in mind, I think one frame of reference is that it's not really public. Like, you don't want those APIs that EMRs expose patient data, right? So this is sensitive data we're talking about. It's healthcare, it's conditions, it's issues, diagnosis, and so you cannot kind of have them open wide for everyone who wants to use them. So there is that sweet spot in terms of privacy, in terms of security, that is absolutely important. But I think where things get complicated is, as a vendor building solutions on top of EMRs or have to integrate to EMRs, we're often faced with a challenge that some of those EMRs either do not have the APIs, or they will build ones custom for you, and that kind of becomes cost prohibitive. And a lot of times those costs are going to be passed back to the clinic, who often are not happy about added cost when it comes to integrations. So in my opinion, and to add to that, if you come from the previous generations, if you're an EMR vendor or provider, your goal is to keep, it's kind of vendor lock-in. My goal is to keep you as a clinic on my EMR and not have you switch. And so if I open it too wide, it makes it easier for another EMR vendor to come and siphon all of that data into the other EMR, and makes it very easy for you to switch. So in the previous world order, vendors were more inclined to kind of keep that data locked in. One, security and privacy, but security and privacy aside, you would not want to make it easy for the clinic to switch.
But that's a very good point. I mean, in the United States, it's HIPAA. How do you reach HIPAA compliancy if your EMR is open and there are people going in and extracting data?
You can still be compliant, and the way you do it is basically you have to make sure whoever is integrated with you is also compliant, right? So if you are compliant, but then you integrate something that is not compliant, then you're not compliant. And so essentially it's on the API provider, for example, to ensure that whoever is the consumer is actually following HIPAA.
But there's also sort of a difference between being HIPAA certified and being HIPAA compliant. I mean, to some extent, aren't the EMRs policing who has access to their APIs based off HIPAA in a way?
Yes and no. Because at the end of the day, the data that resides in the EMR is not the EMR's data. It's the clinic's data. So it's actually on the clinic to ensure that, whoever is accessing their data is actually following the best practices. Now, to go back to, certified versus, verified versus compliant, generally speaking, there is no HIPAA certified, because there is no regulatory body that says, if you're HIPAA, you're going to come to us and we're going to look at everything and we're going to tell you yes or no. There are bodies that do HIPAA verification. So you take your application, and we do this all the time, is where we take our application and we have a ton of documentation that explains what the application does, what kind of data it accesses, how it accesses that data, where does it collect it from, where does it end up, how does it get stored. And it's not just the data, it's also about the team who touches that data. If our team is touching that data, is that team residing in the US, what kind of access they have, what level of access they have, and all of these are kind of fall within HIPAA. And you can take this to third-party auditing companies that you can present your application, what it does, the documentation. Sometimes they might look at even at the code-based level and say, yep, this is verified. Or they might say, hey, you need to do 1, 2, 3, and then once you do that, we'll give you the verification. This also usually includes you completing additional security testing, penetration testing to be certified, or I would say verified.
Okay. That makes sense. So then, so you have two vendors now that are both HIPAA compliant, the clinic, everything, and you have the API, which is how AI agents can potentially get access to patient information and complete tasks. So how much money does it cost the clinic to... There's sort of two questions here. One is, A, clinics are charging for API access, and B, why are they charging for API access? Does it actually require money to operate APIs? Does the infrastructure require money to run? Is kind of the
So
question.
first of all, just to kind of clarify one point, the clinic pays the EMR vendor for access, because you said earlier, the clinic charges. It's not. It's the clinic is charged by the EMR providers for API access.
Charged, my bad.
So absolutely, there's a cost, right? Like if you think about, there was a cost to build that API. That's number one. There's the cost of storing that data. There's the cost of processing power for someone to go access that data. There's security, and usually whenever you go to, let's say, an EMR vendor, they will never just say, oh yeah, hey, you're trying to access clinic ABC's data. Yeah, by all means, just go crazy. Usually there's a testing. Yeah.
Go for it.
Normally you basically complete testing in what I call like a sandbox environment. It's not the actual clinic data. It's a replica of that doesn't really have the patient information, but it kind of behaves and returns that similar type of data and similar structure to the real application with the real patient data. So normally any vendor who wants to complete an integration with an EMR will usually go against that sandbox API, test, make sure everything flows smoothly, make sure you're pulling the right things, pushing the right data. And only after you've completed that, then you can actually take the application to production. And as you can see, as an EMR vendor, one, you have to provide the sandbox account. Two, if our developers, for example, have some questions about how certain API behaves, or if there's a problem because the API is not responding with the right things. So there is a support effort on the EMR vendor side to basically make sure you can integrate. And that's kind of what the EMRs would charge for, which I think it's reasonable. What I see unreasonable sometimes is, the EMR provider trying to charge you as an integrator, for example, like custom fees, or like the most ridiculous I've heard is like $20,000 for them to expose an API. I'm like, guys, you should have this already. So you want to charge me $20,000 for one clinic to access this, and right? So I think that's where it starts to not make sense. The big EMR vendors, generally speaking, have mature APIs. And they charge for access, yes. Usually it's kind of transaction based or transaction volume based. So if you let's say 1,000 calls, 10,000 calls to APIs, they might charge you $500, $600 for. But if you're hitting volume as well, then it might be more expensive.
Okay, that makes sense. And, there's a lot of sort of talks about like vibe coding, control C, control V, like how much of this EMR integration, I don't know if you want to give up any of your secret sauce, but when you're building agents for EMRs, how much like work is this really? Is it a long process?
The answer, as usual, it depends, because it depends on what kind of data you're accessing and how many calls you have to make to get that data. It also depends on the use case, right? So typically when we do this, a simple integration might be, say, 2-3 weeks. A much more complex integration, however, can take a couple of months, maybe 3 months. But usually and again, to give you kind of more nuance to that, if all I'm trying to do is create a patient, it's maybe one API call and I can go create the patient in the EMR and done. But let's say, for example, I want to be able to analyze the patient, look at their history, and grab all the previous documentation, and that's actually much more nuanced, and that might take time. So the time and effort is usually a function of what you're trying to do.
But if I had, for example, an agent that was incredibly complicated, like it needed basically access to almost every single API that existed, and I reached out to all the blue chip EMRs, ModMed, Athena, eClinical, Epic. How long of a process would it take for me to integrate with all these EMRs? Like you said earlier, there's testing, all these things.
The shortest that we're able to do is usually a month. So it could be a month process, maybe 6 weeks. We find when there's delays, it's not really about the work itself. It's coordinating with people, right? You're coordinating with another team from the EMR vendor. There might be a ticketing process, and then sometimes bureaucracy gets in the way, right? So what I find takes longer is the bureaucracy and the paperwork aspect of it, not the actual technical work involved. It's all the, aligning of people on both ends or on multiple fronts, because even for us to go and access the EMR for clinic A, I need, first of all, EMR vendor, if I go to them directly and say, hey, can you give me access to Clinic A's data? They're going to be like, who are you, man? And why would I, right? So they usually go to the clinic, get consent, approvals, sign the necessary paperwork with the clinic, then they'll give us access.
And could you build an AI agent for an EMR without having a clinic that has access to that EMR? Could you just go to Epic right now and build an AI agent for them and they'll let you do it?
You could, but that's a very tough sell, especially if you go to the big EMR vendors. And first of all, Epic is actually doing a lot of work around the AI space and the AI space. They're working on a ton of agents. They have a lot of interesting things to look at. But generally speaking, there are EMRs who kind of have like a partnership model where you can go or a marketplace model where you can go look at their APIs, they're open, you can build an app and launch it on their marketplace. Yes. In other instances, again, for EMRs who are maybe not in the blue chip tier and kind of maybe in the lower tier, it's a much more complex process. And usually the answer is no.
Okay. That makes sense. And if an EMR is building its own agent that is exactly the same as your agent, are they allowed to kind of say, hey, we already have this, we're not going to open the APIs up to them, take ours?
Usually no. Because keep in mind, at the end of the day, if you think about it from the clinic standpoint, it's the clinic's data. And so, can I, as an EMR vendor, bar a clinic from accessing their own data or consuming it in different ways? I think the answer is no to that. Of course, there is, like workarounds and legal workarounds and, justifications that could happen. But, given enough incentive for the clinic and for the vendor to get access to the EMR, I believe you can almost always force your way in if this happens.
Don't you think that potentially with all of the agents you're building and all the EMRs and all of this integration, wouldn't it just be easier for you to make Shoukri EMR that's open to AI agents?
Oof, that's a good question, and it kind of goes into the BitLab thesis. Eventually, I believe that EMRs will be rewritten as AI agents. For now, the EMR role becomes more like just a data warehouse. And so I believe that EMRs will be rewritten as AI agents. Right now, the phase we're in is more, AI agents being built around EMRs. But eventually, if you have enough AI agents that are, the data is flowing through all of them, then eventually you can basically seamlessly almost replace the EMR with minimal interruptions.
Got it. And do you think there's anything that the EMRs are doing poorly? I mean, I don't know if you want to burn any bridges, but it may be something they're not doing very well currently.
I mean, like every market, you have people who are, like leading. And I think Epic is a good example of those who are leading the charge. Like Epic are doing a ton of work around AI and AI agents and embedding all of that into kind of their EMR. However, in my opinion, you can't tell whether that effort is going to be successful or not. And for those of you who are entrepreneurial, there is the concept of the innovator's dilemma. So there's a book by Christian Clayton that talks about the innovator's dilemma. That essentially you as a company or as a startup, you start very, very small, you're nimble and lean and agile and fast. And so you manage to basically build some cool things, build it quickly, capture a market. But the more you build, as you grow, the slower you become. You have to create a structure around you. And eventually that structure becomes a prison. And so, in my opinion, those large EMRs are at a disadvantage, even when they innovate and even when they try to innovate, just by virtue of their size and complexity and the structure with people around it as well, that makes it harder for them to innovate. And therefore, there is always startups who are going to come and kind of eat the EMR's lunch or eat pretty much any established company's launch, right? And this is played out in every industry. It doesn't have to be just the medical industry, but this played out in every industry you can think of against every vendor that you can think of, right? A good example of that is, let's look at Google, right? OpenAI comes out of nowhere, poof, they innovated, and now all of a sudden they were ahead of Google, right? Google, we're talking about Google here. And so this, to me,
Yeah,
it's just the
of
fact
course.
of life, right? It's the innovation cycle, it's the life cycle of every company, it's the life cycle of humans too. Is that you're young and you're fresh and you're full of energy, and then you get to a point where you're old and you die, and that's the state of the world.
Yeah, and even thinking about that, it kind of makes me think. Just flowing off the top of my head here, there's probably an interesting history to these EMRs because they didn't exist. They're probably 20 years old around. There was probably an entire different system at some point that used paper, and then at some point these EMRs would have been coming in, disrupting that industry, and now it's time for AI agents to come and disrupt that industry.
That's how it plays out. And there are, and
That's
believe it or
good
not,
point.
there are some EMRs that are still built. Like we work with some EMRs right now that are really, you look at them and you're like, my God, it's horrible. This has been built in the 1990s, right? The UI is terrible. The design is absolutely garbage. And then some of them are actually a mishmash of pieces that are new and pieces that are old, and it's fun to look at.
Yeah. I spoke to one guy who was a nurse practitioner, and he said that he paid to have a really nice EMR. I won't say which one it was, but he says it just looks nice. Like he just wants to open up his computer and have like a nice modern design. He doesn't want it to look like completely 90s, just all pixelated. No, it's a fair point. Okay, so then we've sort of talked about how EMRs have APIs. What's an API? Are APIs pointless? What's the future of APIs? What you're doing with APIs? But then there's now also MCP. So we can dive into MCP.
Yes. So in a world where applications need to talk, like when an app needs to talk to another app, API was that way, right? So if I needed to push data or pull data, I would call an API on app 1, and then that's how app 1 and app 2 talk. Then comes along the kind of, the LLMs, large language models, and AI agents. And out of Anthropic, who's the parent company behind Claude, they proposed another protocol. And an API, an API is not quite a protocol, but it's an approach. But Anthropic came out with a protocol called MCP, stands for Model Context Protocol. And you want to think about MCP is kind of the API for AI agents. And the difference, I think it's helpful to kind of break down the difference between, let's say, an API and MCP, right? And so the API would allow integration of app to app, and an MCP is more like an app to an agent. And then we'll touch upon what's called, this is another new one called the A2A protocol. This is one that was proposed by Google, which is agent to agent. How do agents exchange information amongst themselves? But to stay on the MCP topic, so when we started, Benny, we defined the API as a contract, right? An API, in essence, is a contract that says, if you send me data in this way, I will respond in this way, right? That's the contract. And the MCP allows for arbitrary contract. So you really don't have to have a contract. The MCP supports discoverability. So the agent can talk to an MCP endpoint and say, hey, what kind of data do you have? Oh, great, you have this kind and this kind. So this allows for the agent interacting with the MCP to decide what tool to use or what data will be exchanged. So it supports kind of discoverability as well. And so that's kind of one of the core differences. But if I look at it today, a lot of MCPs are actually just accessing internal APIs. Because again, it has to realize the functionality, but the MCP will describe what each API does and what kind of data exchanges, which makes it easier for the AI agent to reference that data and pull data and push data and interact. So this generation of MCP is more like wrappers around APIs, but I think there's going to be iterations around that, and there will be interesting paradigms where this changes. And then we go now, if you want to go to A2A or kind of agent to agent protocol, this takes it a level higher, right? Because if we say, in the old world, you had application talking to application. Now you have agent talking to application. And then soon, and when we talk about especially in the multi-agent world, where a lot of things will be built across multiple agents, we need a way for those two agents to chat amongst themselves and decide, oh, what are you doing? What am I doing? And, oh, what data do you have? What data do I have? And this way we basically communicate, collaborate, negotiate, and decide who's doing what. And that's kind of the next innovation. Keep in mind, this is still, relatively new. I think it was April of this year when, Google announced the A2A protocol. You have to watch, there's a lot of times in technology, protocols come and then you might jump on board of them and you start to implement them, and then the industry as a whole decides, you know what, no, we don't like this, we're going to do something else now, right? And there's a lot of examples that, like, if there are people who are old enough, who are a little bit technical or might be familiar, there's something called SOAP protocol. Unless you have a legacy system, nobody knows what the heck this is, right? This is the kind of the old APIs. Yeah. So there's REST. I think REST you might have heard of, REST endpoints or REST APIs, and JSON, data exchange. In the old world, you used to exchange a lot of XML. You don't want to know, trust me. And it was SOAP API. So it remains to be seen whether A2A, will get the adoption. But for example, MCP. Why I think it's interesting is Claude proposed it first, and then OpenAI and almost all the other, LLM and agent vendors, providers, companies are adopting that. So we see the MCP's adoption. A2A, there are signs of adoption, but it's still very, very new. So you want to watch and see.
But do you think the government should be involved in these kinds of systems? Like, should government be getting involved and saying, hey, MCP is going to be the standard, or this is going to be the standard?
God, no, man. That'll be Europe. No? If we do that, then that'll be Europe, and Europe is a mess, right? I think here is how I would phrase it, right? I think there's a funny saying that the US innovates and Europe regulates, and so I think
Yes, and we've talked about that before.
I think regulation would kill innovation, right? If you want to slow things down, just add the layer of regulation and bureaucracy around it, and then it's dead.
That makes sense. Do you think Google is larger than the economy of some countries. Do you think that with them doing agent to agent, it's enough for it to become a standard?
It's not about what Google is doing. Of course, Google is big enough and has let's say power across the internet, absolutely. But there's a lot of things that Google proposed that didn't end up panning out. So generally speaking, in my opinion, it's like the market will decide, and I think the market will decide as a function of what problems does A2A solve, and will some other company or other companies come up with something better, right? That's what it boils down to. And we always we always invent something, and then we hit the limitations around it, and that might force us to either improve it or say or something better comes along, and we just go and kind of ride that wagon. So that's what I think will play out in the next 6 months to 12 months.
Okay, so if MCP becomes the standard and every EMR has MCP, and every piece of tech has MCP, and large language models are roaming free, what does this future kind of look like, especially for the medical industry?
All the functionality being wrapped. For now, I think we'll see a lot of the functionality wrapped as MCP servers. But in the future, I think it's probably going to go more towards A2A, so agent to agents exchanging data, and I think. Well, time will prove. I think we'll go with this episode for the record and see what happens. But I believe that the future is going to be much more agent to agent, and almost all the functionality exposed by an application, a platform, will be really agents that are handling that. And it's essentially, I think MCP might be like a transient phase.
Got it. So you really believe that agent to agent is the true future then?
I think so. I think, and this is because, going back to my original thesis, that all applications and across all the industries will be rewritten as AI agents. And usually, if it's a complex enough application, one agent cannot do the job well, at least for now. But it's going to be multiple agents, each one of them handles a function, right? So if I think about an EMR and what an EMR rewritten as multi-agents would look like, there is an agent responsible for medications, and all it worries about is medications for patients. And then there's an agent responsible for all the lab work, and then there's another agent responsible for handling new patient intake, and there's another agent responsible for like what's called clinical decision support. So I believe that pretty much all the software that we have today will be rewritten as AI agents, and each one of us will have probably one primary assistant that will have access to all of these other agents, and essentially that's the Siri, right? And if you think about the role of like iOS, or like like if you're an Apple phone or using iOS, in the old paradigm, Apple controlled all the things or all the services you got access to, and all of these things were apps. But in the new world order, apps will die. And essentially, the new operating system, I think the new iOS killer, is going to be potentially a device. And that device only has that device's primary function is an AI agent, a voice, maybe a video agent, and you access the entire aspect or spectrum of services via agents, right? So, I'm talking to Siri, just to simplify the paradigm, I might be talking to Siri, and Siri is actually talking to the Uber agent and getting me a cab, right? Or Siri is actually talking to the Instacart agent and ordering my groceries. So I believe in the future, essentially, and that's why I think we're seeing already an arms race, because that, or he who creates that helpful AI assistant or agent that facilitates all the access is essentially the Apple of the next decade.
Got it. Okay. So in the future, basically you're suggesting I have my AI agent in every single company or organization as an AI agent, and they're always communicating. So I could, let's say I want to book a hotel room. My agent talks to the hotel's agent, books me a room. But what is required? We've sort of covered that agent-to-agent framework needs to exist broadly for this to function. But what else is needed? Like energy, infrastructure? How can we make this a reality?
I think agent discoverability is another one that's missing. And I'll give you an example, right? So how do you know let's say you were living in a village, no internet, okay? And now you move to the US. And how do you learn about all the services that are there? You're hearing about it from friends, or you're hearing about it from Google, right? You go and research something, and then you go find the service. So I think discoverability, and this is why I think even like Google search is like I think the search as we know it is dead, because the new generation of search is more about arming your AI agent or your AI assistant with a way to discover services around the internet, right? Or the agent web. I should probably call this the agent web, but because I think the next generation of the internet is less about pages that you and I see, and more about services that your AI assistant will discover, and then so it becomes your assistant will go discover a service or multiple services, compare them based on price, takes into consideration your preference, and based on that it'll go do the job. And you just give it your money, and it decides what to buy, where to spend, and it will do the entire job. And I think this is a pretty exciting future, if you ask me.
Yeah. Okay. And I mean, I'm already using ChatGPT for that purpose. It's already going and pulling data from Google for me.
And that's my thesis, is that OpenAI is probably going there already, right? If you think about, if just observe how many things now OpenAI in the last 6 months or so integrate to. Now they're in your Google Drive, and now they're pulling your emails. And also if you use Linear for your project management, they're pulling from Linear, and they have access to GitHub for your code base. And again, by extension, you're going to see them access Instacart and access Uber, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's going to be an arms race of the the agent providers integrating more and more of the services we have on the outside. And if you're a service provider, the whole game is to just make it much easier and simpler for agents to access your service that you have to offer.
I noticed that they did an update for Google and now Gemini exists on Google search. What's your thoughts on that?
They're trying to catch up, man. Otherwise, they're toast.
Yeah. Yeah. So then that's very interesting. So we've sort of covered what the future looks like with MCP both and A2A in both the medical industry. I guess, what about agent to agent in the medical industry now?
So
what would that look like?
You need the protocol, and maybe that's A2A. To me, there's no differentiation. The type of data that agents exchange might look different, right? If I'm getting an Uber, it's more about, what's the fare now and where am I going and the destination. But if I talk about healthcare, it's going to be all kind of patient focused. So can A2A service this use case? Probably yes. Would we see more specialized version of A2A that is more healthcare focused? That's a possibility.
In the world, with all these different countries with their own different healthcare industries, who do you think will be the first to innovate with agents?
Definitely not
broadly.
Europe. Well, it's going to be the US. I believe it's the US. If you look at
Europe.
who's leading the whole agent revolution, it's OpenAI, it's Claude, it's all of these guys, and most of them are US based.
So would you say the future looks bright for the American AI
we'll see
industry?
what happens in China, because I think there is what's not being said is that there is are you familiar with AGI, or artificial general intelligence?
I've heard it spoken about before, I believe, on Lex Friedman.
And so if you think about what AGI is essentially a computer intelligence that not only, like, essentially that surpasses human intelligence. And there is an arms race, in my opinion. Essentially there's going to be, if you read history and you go back to the time of the race between the US and Russia at the time to put a man on the moon, or you think about building the kind of the nuclear bomb, or the race for the atomic bomb. I believe that there is already a Cold War ongoing right now, because that nation, that state that will build AGI first will likely have the upper hand in the next century. The upper hand to control the world, pretty much. I think it's kind of world domination is the stake now. No, this has been fun. Thank you, because you teased out a lot of insights out of my head with just like the last 10 minutes. That was good.